Welcome to the Puzzle Proof, where mysteries begin. Every clue is a deception. Every answer leads to more questions. Only the sharpest minds will see the truth hiding in plain sight. An insurmountable illusion where every detective failed. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Invitation. Lightning flickered across the grey afternoon sky as a small group gathered in the back room of a discreet club, lured there by an intriguing invitation. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old leather, giving a sense of intimacy and secrecy. At the front, a tall man with a sharp, almost predatory gaze cleared his throat to speak. He introduced himself as Lionel Twain, a name that elicited wary glances from the curious onlookers. His voice was measured, each syllable controlled and precise. He spoke of a grand event awaiting them, a dinner at his secluded mansion where they would face a fiendish puzzle. He paused dramatically, letting tension build, before mentioning the key detail. A murder mystery was at its heart. Intrigued murmurs rippled through the crowd, but the exact nature of the mystery remained elusive. All they knew was that something perilous awaited. Caution mingled with excitement, stirring a collective sense of adventure. In one shadowy corner, a detective and his young assistant listened intently. The detective, sporting a worn fedora and a skeptical brow, had chased elusive criminals across the globe. His reputation for methodical thoroughness was legendary. His assistant, on the other hand, brimmed with restless energy, itching for an opportunity to prove himself. Neither had ever encountered such an invitation. A murder game disguised as a dinner party. Still, curiosity overshadowed caution. They exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that whatever awaited them was worth investigating. Moments after Lionel Twain finished speaking, he vanished into the haze of cigar smoke as though he had never been there. The detective craned his neck, searching for any sign of Twain's retreating figure, but caught only the swish of a door closing. It was enough to make him suspect the man possessed a flair for illusions. Beside him, the assistant's eyes shone with a mix of excitement and unease. This was no typical client meeting. It felt more like stepping onto a stage where a hidden audience watched their every move. On their way out of the club, the detective and his assistant passed a few other intrigued souls discussing the invitation in hushed tones. A stooped gentleman in tweed murmured something about secret passages, while a haughty woman in pearls insisted she had solved murders far more dangerous. The detective made mental notes, suspecting he might see these individuals again at the mansion. An odd energy crackled in the air, hinting at impending drama. The stage, it seemed, was already set for a performance they could not fully comprehend. Stepping outside, they found the sky had darkened further, the threat of a genuine storm looming. Raindrops began to patter on the pavement, creating a rhythmic pulse that matched the detective's rising anticipation. Clutching their coats tightly, they hurried across the slick street, discussing the night's revelations in hushed undertones. Who was Lionel Twain truly? Why bring together such a varied assortment of strangers for a dinner? And most importantly, what murder did he expect them to solve? Curiosity battled with doubt. Could this be a mere parlor trick, an elaborate ruse for amusement? The detective doubted it. Lionel Twain's unwavering gaze and cryptic tone signaled a genuine threat. Tonight was no charade. The detective sensed danger ahead, and yet he felt compelled to accept the invitation. Intrigue, it seemed, outweighed common sense. Before departing, the assistant glanced back at the now empty lounge. The hush of the space felt heavy with untold secrets. Somewhere within that silence, Lionel Twain was waiting, orchestrating unknown twists. The detective and his assistant shared a brief nod, then set out. Their next destination, the forbidding mansion. Chapter 2. Arrival at the eerie mansion. As twilight deepened, the detective's old sedan rattled up a winding driveway that cut through a dense thicket of bare, gnarled trees. Thunder rumbled from overhead, although the swirling clouds seemed oddly still. Each bend in the road revealed more of the looming silhouette of Lionel Twain's mansion, its spires and towers cutting a jagged outline against the darkening sky. The detective gripped the steering wheel with knuckles gone white, while his assistant peered nervously through the window. Despite the swirling gloom, they could sense an unnatural hush, as though the grounds themselves had been holding their breath in anticipation of their arrival. The gravel driveway ended at a pair of towering iron gates, flanked by weather-beaten statues. One statue, in the shape of a stoic gargoyle, seemed to glare directly at the detective, as if challenging him to turn back. Yet he pressed the pedal forward. To their surprise, the gates swung open on their own, creaking ominously. No caretaker or guard appeared to greet them, only the mechanical groan of rusted hinges. The detective and his assistant exchanged a tense look, aware that nothing about this place was ordinary. Upon stepping out of the car, they noticed a thin fog creeping along the ground. The assistant thought he saw faint shapes moving in the mist, but they vanished whenever he focused on them. A stiff breeze whipped at their coats, accompanied by a sudden flash of lightning. Immediately, the mansion's front doors swung open, revealing a cavernous foyer illuminated by flickering electric lights. Inside, the grand entrance was littered with scattered leaves, overturned chairs, and damp footprints as though a tempest had torn through moments earlier. A deep rumble of thunder seemed to come from within the walls, amplifying the impression that the house itself was in the throes of a perpetual storm. Before they could voice their confusion, a tall, slender figure materialized from the shadows. The butler, clad in a black tailcoat and wearing a perpetually aloof expression, inclined his head. His movements were graceful but slightly disconcerting, as though he floated rather than walked. "Welcome," he intoned quietly. "My master, Mr. Twain, has outfitted the mansion with special machines to replicate stormy weather at all hours. He finds it sets the mood." The detective couldn't decide if this was mere eccentricity or something more sinister. Meanwhile, his assistant couldn't look away from the cracks of synthetic lightning that illuminated the corridor overhead. As the butler led them across the storm-tossed foyer, they noticed wires strung along the walls, connected to small, humming contraptions. The detective guessed these were the devices responsible for the peals of artificial thunder. Whenever lightning flashed outside, a matching flash erupted from hidden bulbs in the corners. The synchronization was eerie, as if real and man-made storms were locked in competition. Even more disquieting was a faint sense that the thunderous noise might be masking other sounds, footsteps perhaps, or whispered conversations. Reaching the base of a wide staircase, the butler paused to inform them that dinner would be served shortly. However, he cautioned them to watch their step. "Some of our guests have encountered mishaps," he said without elaboration. Just then, the detective's assistant yelped. A nearby bag, which had been left in the foyer, was emitting a thin wisp of smoke. When they peered inside, they saw a small scorch mark on the fabric, as if a fire had briefly ignited. The detective stamped out the smouldering patch while the butler merely bowed and vanished up the stairs, offering no explanation. Alone in darkness, they braced themselves for the unknown. Chapter 3. Strange Discoveries and New Arrivals. At the top of the sweeping staircase, the butler's deliberate steps seemed to echo in time with distant rumbles of thunder, both real and mechanical. The detective and his assistant followed him down a long, dim corridor, where every door appeared identical, each set in a wall lined with faded wallpaper. An occasional flash of artificial lightning through a nearby window illuminated the butler's tall figure, throwing elongated shadows across the floor. Halfway along the corridor, the butler paused in front of a door to inform them that their room lay just ahead. His voice was thin, almost hollow. Before the detective could mutter a single word of thanks, the butler slipped away, disappearing around a corner as though swallowed by the mansion's gloom. The detective and his assistant exchanged puzzled looks. It was becoming clear that normal social niceties had no place in this bizarre setting. No sooner had they turned the handle of the door than the assistant let out a startled cry. One of their suitcases, left leaning against the wall, was emitting a faint, eerie glow from inside. Smoke curled from its seams, and the distinct odor of singed fabric filled the corridor. Heart hammering, the assistant crouched down and unfastened the case. There, nestled among his neatly folded clothes, was a tiny patch of fire, smouldering in the lining. Frantically, he patted at it with his jacket sleeve until the flames sputtered out. When the smoke finally cleared, they realized how close they had come to a proper blaze. Yet the most unsettling part was that the butler had vanished without a sound, leaving them to grapple with this peculiar hazard alone. At last, they entered their assigned room, but found little solace there. The walls were adorned with aged portraits whose subjects had unsettlingly vacant gazes, as if bearing witness to the guests' every move. A musty odor seeped from the velvet drapes, framing a window that overlooked a dark courtyard. Determined to shake off the lingering unease, the detective decided to dig into the mansion's past. He produced a slim folder containing newspaper clippings he had unearthed prior to arriving. By the dim glow of a single lamp, he and his assistant read stories of the mansion's tragic legacy, alleged suicides, unexplained accidents, and whispered rumors about one of its former owners descending into madness. Each piece of grim history added to their growing conviction that Lionel Twain's invitation was not merely about a game, it might be flirting with genuine danger. While they pored over the documents, other arrivals began filtering into the mansion. Voices drifted up from the foyer, among them a high-pitched complaint, followed by a weary sigh. The detective recognized the renowned Belgian investigator Milo Perrier and his much-harassed assistant Marcel. Even from upstairs he could hear the two trading barbs, a comedic yet abrasive soundtrack that reverberated along the corridors. Their entrance served as a reminder that multiple sleuths had been summoned here, each presumably invited to participate in the same cryptic murder game. As he stepped into the hallway to see who else had arrived, the detective caught a glimpse of a maid gliding silently past. She wore a plain uniform and kept her eyes lowered, but something about her presence sent a shiver along his spine. Whispers floated through the air that she could not speak, read, or write. Yet her quiet movements radiated an uncanny awareness. Before he could address her, she vanished around a corner, much like the butler had, leaving only a faint echo of footsteps. Meanwhile, another detective and his assistant had ventured outside to investigate why the telephone in the foyer produced nothing but static. They discovered, to their alarm, that the main telephone wire had been sliced clean through. Clearly, someone intended to cut off all contact with the outside world. Night gathered around them, thick with the promise of peril and unspoken questions. As the detective returned to his room, one thought crystallized in his mind. This mansion was becoming less a stage for a light-hearted puzzle and more a labyrinth of treachery, one from which no one could be sure they would escape unscathed. Chapter 4. Miss Marple and the Announcement. By late evening, the mansion's corridors hummed with fresh voices and anxious whispers. A steady procession of guests had arrived in response to Lionel Twain's mysterious summons. Detectives, their assistants, and other curious individuals whose skills or notoriety seemed tailor-made for a high-stakes game. Among these latecomers was a silver-haired woman of petite stature who introduced herself in a sweet but firm voice as Miss Marple. At a glance, her knitted cardigan and kindly smile gave her the aura of a grandmotherly figure visiting for afternoon tea. Yet those who mistook her for a fragile old lady found themselves promptly corrected. Behind her gentle demeanor lay keen eyes and a mind ever watchful for inconsistencies, half-truths, and hidden motives. She had come equipped with her own nurse, an unassuming woman named Florence, under the pretense of safeguarding her health. But from the first words out of Miss Marple's mouth, it was clear she intended to be anything but passive. Her nurse, dutiful and quiet, clutched a small medical bag ready to offer assistance if required. Nevertheless, the detective who had arrived earlier, along with his eager assistant, caught sight of the determined glint in Miss Marple's eyes. In that single look, he was convinced that if push came to shove, she might outsmart every other detective in the mansion. Shortly after Miss Marple's arrival, the butler, whose apparition-like comings and goings had grown no less disconcerting, began leading people to a vast drawing room. He swept down the mansion's main corridor, inviting all present to follow with a stiff bow and a single word: "This way." Intrigued and somewhat wary, the guests convened in the cavernous space. Strangely, the room was devoid of any furniture or decorations. Gone were the ornate chandeliers, side tables, and plush seating typical of a mansion this size. Instead, they stood on bare floorboards under blank walls, feeling oddly exposed, as though placed upon a stage. Whispers filled the empty room as guests speculated why, of all places, they had been brought here. Were they to receive instructions? Was this a test? The growing hunger in many stomachs did not help matters. Indeed, some wondered when dinner would be served. After all, the invitation had promised a grand meal. But as confusion mounted, a piercing shout erupted from the direction of the kitchen. Apparently, the chef had been summarily dismissed for failing to prepare any dish whatsoever. No one could glean why the chef had done nothing, or why he had been fired so abruptly. Discomfort crept through the crowd like a rising chill. A few of the detectives began murmuring to their assistants, speculating that this entire evening was a ruse designed to unsettle them. Suddenly, a metallic clang shattered the hush. A long sword dropped from the ceiling and struck the floor behind a single chair someone had pulled in from the hallway. The noise reverberated in the emptiness, prompting startled gasps. Almost instantly, the lights died. Darkness descended upon the guests like a heavy curtain, leaving them in a collective gasp of fear. In the tense blackness, hearts pounded. Seconds stretched interminably. Then in a burst of brilliance, the lights flickered back on, and a stranger stood at the center of the room. His presence was so abrupt that several guests stumbled backward, not having seen him before. He wore a triumphant expression, a smirk that suggested he had orchestrated this dramatic entrance all along. Extending his arms wide, he announced that the night's true purpose was to solve a murder. He further declared that no one would be permitted to leave until the culprit was caught, their identity laid bare for all to see. Fear, confusion, and a roiling sense of betrayal swept through the gathering. They had come expecting a twisted puzzle, perhaps even a macabre game, but the accusation of an imminent murder turned their sense of security to dust. Every face in the room reflected the same question. Who would be the victim, and who among them was poised to kill? Chapter 5. The Dead Host and the Locked Room. A tense silence fell over the drawing room after the stranger's shocking announcement about solving a murder. He offered no additional insight, refusing to answer questions or even reveal his name. Instead, he retreated into the shadows, where a flicker of lightning from the mansion's contrived storm machines briefly illuminated his unreadable face. Then he was gone, leaving bitterness and dread in the air. The gathered guests stared at each other, minds racing with possibilities. Who among them might be the victim, or, more chillingly, the killer? Moments later, an ear-splitting scream shattered the uneasy quiet. The sound came from somewhere deep within the mansion, echoing through corridors like a banshee's wail. Hearts pounding, the group sprinted toward its source. They found themselves at a neglected corner room, its heavy door ajar. There, sprawled against the wall, lay the body of Lionel Twain, the man who had invited them all. His limbs were rigid, eyes fixed on a point beyond mortal understanding. Even at a glance, it was evident he had been dead for some time, likely well before the lights had gone out in the drawing room. A wave of panic seized the guests as it dawned on them that the murderer was still among them. Someone had orchestrated Lionel Twain's demise, and now the entire night's gathering took on a far more sinister tone. The detective who arrived earlier knelt by the corpse, feeling for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The assistant tried to calm the scattered onlookers, but fear churned in every glance. Without the host's guidance, or the prospect of an ordinary dinner, they were left with only their suspicions, and the uneasy sense that another victim might soon follow. Still determined to unravel the truth, a smaller group recalled rumors of a locked study within the mansion that supposedly held critical information. Perhaps there they could find letters, journals, or documents explaining Lionel Twain's motives. After some searching, one of them found a tarnished key hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway. They carefully made their way to the study's large oak door. The lock clicked open, but when they stepped inside, they found the space empty. No records, no diaries, only dusty shelves and a stale smell of abandonment. Before anyone could voice their disappointment, the door slammed shut behind them with alarming force. Panicked, they tried the handle, but it refused to budge. Worse, some hidden mechanism on the inside seemed to hold it tight. Then a voice crackled through what sounded like a concealed speaker, warning them that every move was being watched. The disembodied tone was cold and mocking, sending chills up their spines. Though the voice did not last long, its message was clear. Time was running out, and the killer was very much in control. Eventually, they managed to pry the door open, regrouping with the others to share the unnerving discovery. In mounting desperation, the guests decided to stick together for their own safety. They lit candles from the dining area and moved in a wary cluster, scanning every corner and shadowy alcove. Their resolve was tested moments later by a distant crash, which reverberated through the upper floors. Immediately, they followed the sound to the butler's quarters. They found the room in disarray, furniture overturned, curtains torn, glass fragments littering the carpet. In the middle of the chaos lay the butler's lifeless body. The grisly sight confirmed their worst fears. Whoever was orchestrating these deadly events was ruthless, cunning, and perpetually a step ahead. Amid the flickering light and the artificial thunder, it felt as if the mansion itself conspired to hide the truth. Now, with 2 people dead and no answers in sight, the guests were left to wonder how many more might fall before the final chapter of this harrowing game was revealed. Chapter 6. Traps, Tricks and Suspicions. The jarring deaths of Lionel Twain and the butler left the mansion's guests shaken to their core. Determined to prevent further loss of life, the detective vowed to inspect every corridor and hidden passage. With a candle in one hand and his heartbeat thrumming in his ears, he began his systematic search. Each step echoed against the walls, intermingling with the perpetual thunderclaps engineered by the mansion's weather machines. A faint rustle of movement behind him made him spin around, but nothing was there. His eyes swept the area, focusing on the flickering shadows thrown by the candlelight. It occurred to him that these phantom footsteps might be deliberate distractions, a way for the killer to mislead him and lure him away from more vital clues. Undeterred, the detective pressed on down a side corridor he hadn't yet explored. Dust motes floated in the stale air, illuminated by periodic flashes of artificial lightning from the windows. At the end of the hall, he discovered a door slightly ajar, through which wafted a faint chemical odor. Carefully pushing it open, he found himself peering into a small chamber lined with metal canisters. An acrid stench hit his nostrils, and he noticed, with growing alarm, that each canister was rigged to a system of wires. One misstep or jolt could trigger the release of some noxious gas. Just then, a voice called out softly from behind him. "It's a trap!" came the warning, though the speaker remained half hidden by the doorway. The detective backed out, heart pounding, pulling the door closed as gently as he could to avoid setting off whatever lethal mechanism lay inside. By the time he turned to thank his rescuer, the figure had slipped away, leaving him alone in the dusky hallway. Meanwhile, a wave of fresh rumors and theories churned among the remaining guests. Tension had reached a fever pitch. No one felt safe, and everyone was desperate for an explanation. Whispers circulated that someone had witnessed a guest seemingly vanish from one corridor and appear in another moments later, suggesting an advanced technical prowess, perhaps the ability to manipulate secret panels or hidden doors. It was a disquieting possibility that the killer might be using illusions and traps to toy with them. Could the murderer be an engineer skilled at staging elaborate, lethal deceptions? In the thick of this paranoia, accusations flew like sparks. John, one of the more outspoken guests, leveled a finger at another individual, someone rumored to have inherited a fortune under dubious circumstances. "You'd kill to avoid paying out $1 million, John hissed, prompting the accused to vehemently deny any financial motive. Another guest then floated the idea that maybe all of them were connected by some past misdeed or entanglement. "Someone's gathered us here because of old grudges and secrets," she suggested. "We have skeletons in our closets, every last one of us." Tense though the discussion was, it also pried open hidden truths. One guest tearfully admitted a past romantic liaison full of betrayal and blackmail. Another confessed to having been expelled from home due to illegal dealings. Still another revealed a past life as a mercenary, paid to track and kill for the highest bidder. With each disclosure, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with suspicion. If everyone had something to hide, then everyone was a potential murderer or a potential target. From behind the locked doors and the endless corridors, the mansion's unseen puppet master seemed to delight in pushing them toward the brink. The detective, returning from his near brush with the gas trap, found the group mid-argument, faces flushed, voices cracking with fear. It was as though the mansion itself fed on their mistrust, fueling the tension inch by agonizing inch. Whether the killer was motivated by unrequited love, the promise of riches, or a vengeful grudge remained unclear. One thing, however, was certain. They were all pawns in a deadly game, and the clock was ticking faster by the moment. Chapter 7: Night of Bombs and Imposters. By the time midnight approached, the mansion's atmosphere was so thick with tension it felt nearly suffocating. In one of the upstairs hallways, a particularly anxious guest, eyes darting at every shadow, decided enough was enough. Rather than risk another brush with hidden traps or lurking murderers, they crept into a vacant bedroom and bolted the door from the inside. If they stayed there alone, they reasoned, no one could harm them. The relative silence that followed their isolation was occasionally pierced by the mechanical rumble of storm machines outside, dutifully manufacturing thunder and lightning. For a while, nothing happened. The guest began to calm, believing perhaps they had found a pocket of safety within the mansion's labyrinthine corridors. Then, so softly at first it might have been imagined, came the hiss. A thin mist seeped under the door. Panic slammed into the guest's chest as they realized it was gas. Was it meant to incapacitate them, or was it flammable, ready to explode? Stumbling to the wall, they discovered a single sheet of paper pinned there. It bore a menacing message: a bomb is set to explode soon. Adrenaline surged and they pounded on the door with every ounce of strength, screaming for help. But to their horror, the door seemed to be sealing itself from the outside, as though an unseen hand turned gears and latches. And by the time the other guests heard the frantic pounding and came running, the bedroom door was jammed tight. They flung themselves at it, shoulders slamming into wood, until finally one powerful shove cracked the door open. Smoke and gas wafted out, forcing them to cough and shield their eyes. Inside, they found the trembling guest on the floor, clutching the ominous note. Though it appeared that no bomb had been triggered, the threat was all too real. The wires near the door and the leftover residue of some chemical gave enough evidence that this was no mere prank. The unseen killer had once again proven an ability to orchestrate elaborate, terrifying traps. Much later that same night, just when everyone thought the worst might be over, a lone figure appeared at the end of a dim corridor. Cloaked in darkness, this stranger claimed to be the mastermind behind every death and frightful incident in the mansion. Nervous and angered guests converged, their voices rising in a clamorous demand for answers. The figure merely laughed, a hollow sound that reverberated against the panelled walls. Yet before they could fully confess or boast of their twisted achievements, another voice, a calm, steady tone, cut through the din. It claimed the name the figure used was in fact that of a person who had died 5 years prior. A hush fell over the corridor. At first, the self-proclaimed villain seemed confused, but then hissed in frustration when pressed for details. The second speaker, stepping out of the shadows, presented evidence, news clippings and official records indicating that the identity in question had no living owner. Whoever stood before them now was an imposter, hiding behind a stolen name and legend. Furious and determined, Miss Marple confronted the impersonator, unleashing a flurry of inquiries, and even offering money if it would prise loose the truth. She had no patience left for half measures. Yet the final, most shocking twist that night came from John, who produced government documents suggesting that the real puppet master, someone once suspected of pulling the strings behind numerous unsolved cases, had long been declared dead. This revelation undercut every assumption the guests had made since they first stepped into Lionel Twain's eerie mansion. If the supposed mastermind had died years ago and this cloaked figure was only imitating him, then who was truly behind the elaborate traps, the staged deaths and the relentless mind games? As the corridor lights flickered and the wind howled through the eaves, the assembled group realized they might be contending with an even more diabolical plot than they had initially feared. Chapter 8. The Grand Deception. In the waning hours of a night that felt interminable, the weary guests assembled in the mansion's grand foyer. A once elegant space, it had become a backdrop for chaos and fear. Shadows stretched across the floor, cast by flickering lanterns and the lightning effects still generated by the hidden storm machines. The detective, looking pale from both exhaustion and the constant strain of keeping his wits about him, stood at the room's center. Around him, the other guests formed a loose circle, their faces etched with apprehension and disbelief. For hours they had been gathering evidence, stumbling upon traps, confronting ominous apparitions, and arguing over who was truly responsible for the mounting horrors. They rehashed every clue: the seemingly dead butler, the frantic telephone wire cutting, the horrifying sight of Lionel Twain's lifeless form, only to discover contradictory accounts of his identity. Miss Marple and John's revelations about imposters and identities that should have been dead further complicated the picture. Now, in a final attempt to create sense from madness, they pieced together a single, coherent story. They began to realize that every disturbing element inside this mansion, from the technology that mimicked torrential weather to the cunning illusions of murder, had been orchestrated as part of an elaborate whodunit. The detective recounted the rigged canisters of gas, the carefully timed lighting blackouts, and the oddly staged corpses that never seemed to require a police intervention. Piece by piece, they uncovered a tapestry of deceit whose threads intertwined with every sinister twist they had witnessed. No one could agree on who masterminded it all, but the consensus was that everything had been planned with near military precision. Just as the group reached the threshold of understanding, a mocking laugh rippled through the foyer. Heads snapped in all directions until, at the top of the grand staircase, a figure emerged, draped in shadow, face partially obscured by a half-mask, voice distorted by some mechanical device. The masked figure offered a slow, sarcastic applause, each clap echoing around the silent hall. Heartbeats hammered in the guests' ears. They braced themselves for yet another twist. "Well done," the figure intoned, its voice genderless and strangely metallic. "You've all done a marvelous job playing your roles." A hush of confusion descended. No one dared to speak or move. "I'm sure you're wondering about the murders, the illusions and the traps. Let me assure you, no one truly died tonight." Gasps and disbelieving murmurs arose. The detective's eyes darted toward the corner where not too long ago the butler's body had been found. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple demanded, her voice trembling with indignation. With a theatrical sweep of an arm, the figure explained how each apparent victim had been part of an elaborate ruse. The butler, the chef, and even Lionel Twain himself had played roles in this grand deception. From hidden compartments, they had swapped real bodies for look-alike mannequins or slipped away in the darkness. The illusions of gore or death had been meticulously staged. Every horrifying scream or panicked scene was prearranged, designed to lock the guests into a spiraling dance of suspicion and terror.
"But why?" someone cried out, their voice tinged with outrage. "For fame," the figure replied, the mechanical distortion lending an almost inhuman chill to the words. "For notoriety. Imagine the headlines. The unsolvable murder, confounding the world's greatest detectives. Once revealed, the story would be worth a fortune, not to mention the prestige of masterminding the perfect crime." As the figure spoke, the rest of the pieces slid into place for the stunned guests. This had never been a murder investigation so much as a performance. They had all been pawns, unwitting actors in a show orchestrated for profit and celebrity. No genuine killings, only illusions designed to provoke fear and suspicion. Shock and humiliation tore through the assembly, more painful than any physical blow.
Suddenly, the front doors to the mansion were thrown open, letting in a blast of cool air and the first rays of a reluctant dawn. The still operating storm machines clicked off with a sharp mechanical whir, plunging the foyer into a jarring silence. Guards, or actors playing guards, pushed the stunned guests out onto the gravel driveway, heedless of their protests. In the pale light of morning, they could see the mansion's imposing architecture now stripped of its terrifying aura. Without the thunder and illusions, it was merely an oversized house on a lonely hill. Their humiliation complete, the guests realized they had been released from the twisted game. Some shook with anger, others stood in dazed disbelief. Was anything real? Had there ever been a genuine threat? The detective, looking back at the mansion's entrance, caught a final glimpse of the masked figure stepping into the shadows. Anger mingled with relief as the guests mulled over the incredible hoax. While no physical harm had come to most of them, their reputations and sense of dignity were undoubtedly bruised. Miss Marple, John, Milo Perrier, Marcel, and all the others had been bested by a theatrical con. For all their skill, they had been cornered by illusions. Though arguments flared, no single individual could pinpoint precisely who was behind the mask. Was it truly Lionel Twain, or another imposter with advanced resources? No one would ever know the full truth. One thing, however, stood out with sharp clarity. In this mansion, illusions had become reality, and reality had been twisted into a spectacle. As the guests dispersed, they carried with them a final, unsettling memory of just how fragile the line between fact and deception could be.